Welcome on behalf of Pearls and Irritations to this podcast. My name is John Menadue. I'm the founder and editor-in-chief of Pearls and Irritations. And my wife says she's the pearl and I'm the irritation, and maybe that's right. But in any event, we aim at Pearls and Irritations to present to the public in our journal issues which we believe the mainstream media is neglecting or is not adequately or fairly presented to the Australian community. One of those issues, of course, is climate change, and the other one, which we want to discuss today, is our relations with the United States, with China, and what that means to us. It's my pleasure to interview today Dr Mike Gilligan, who writes regularly for us in Pearls and Irritations on defence matters and our relationship with the United States. Mike worked for about 20 years in defence policy, evaluating military proposals for development in Australia's interest. And as part of that work with the Department of Defence, he worked for a time in the Pentagon in the United States. So it's a pleasure to have Mike with us today. As I mentioned earlier, we are concerned about our relations with the United States, and in particular, the Americanization, as I often call it, of Australia by America across the board, in our media, in our think tanks, in our politics, in our economy. Our two major companies, BHP and the Commonwealth Bank, are American-owned. And that's a general problem we have across our whole economy and society, the Americanization of so much. And one area in which there has been that Americanization is defence. And perhaps, Mike, as an introduction, you could describe in general terms the problem, how our sovereignty has been affected, and then perhaps we can look at some of the particular problems that we have encountered.
Thanks, John. I think even before that, at the outset, I ought to say that nothing of what I talk about today is not open source. In particular, when I talk about American planning, it will be of many years ago, but it's still relevant today. And I learnt much of what I knew of US planning, not so much from sitting in my own particular job in the Pentagon, but from buying a magazine that was publicly available on the newsstand at any metro station called the Armed Forces Journal, which intimately covered the security developments that were going on at that time and for many years afterwards.
Mark, one of the issues which we face regularly in the media particularly, is the assumption that ANZUS secures in some way American support in the event that we suffer a military setback or we're invaded in some form. Is that really true? That is ANZUS, like NATO, guaranteeing us American support?
Well, the general point is that Australia is the victim of some very fundamental political developments in the US, which happened to come about. Their origins were about the time that I was in Washington, and that is the emergence of the neocons, the neoconservative movement. And that has produced a rapacious America who thrusts everything aside in pursuit of its own goals. And whereas before we had, for 45 years, a fairly untroubled part of the world here, and we had, with the agreement of the Americans, a sovereign defence policy. Our problem is that it no longer suits America, and America has just cast that aside. And we are having to deal with the after effects of being essentially treated as pawns by America and its neoconservative approach to the world. So that's essentially the backdrop of it, John.
In that loss of sovereignty, if you like, towards the United States, the assumption which many Australians have is that ANZUS requires the United States to come to our aid, just like NATO would in Europe. Is that the case? Is ANZUS give us that support?
John, I haven't put it as boldly as this in my writings, but I believe that the portrayal of ANZUS is a fraud on the Australian people. It's perpetrated by every government since Robert Menzies first announced it, and it's been that fraud has been fostered by academia, the intelligentsia, and the not so intelligent mass media.
Years ago, in fact, it goes back to the Fraser government in 1976 that they developed an important defence white paper on self-reliance. That seemed to be, to me, to set the pattern for Australian appropriate defence policy for Australia. What was that saying, that defence white paper that we've almost forgotten?
Well, let's go back just a little fraction more on that. There had been for many years some sort of wondering about what that clause meant. Many people within defence thought that the Americans might interpret this clause, which made it clear that they were not committing to our security. They might interpret that generously. As it turned out, they didn't. They interpreted it in one direction, which was all towards America. It wasn't. So Australia fiddled and twiddled for 20 years after ANZUS was signed, not knowing how to deal with the relationship with America. It wasn't until the Vietnam War started to fall apart for the Americans, and the Nixon administration announced something called the Guam Doctrine, whereby Nixon said, as far as America was concerned, every nation in Asia was assumed to take care of its own defences. And us being in Asia, we realised that applied to us as well as it applied to Vietnam, it applied to anybody. America was saying, we're out of here. There was, never mind the complication of Japan. But as a result, there was some fairly close and hard thinking within the Australian government and official circles. And they decided that we had to respond to that very clear directive. And the only way to do that was to turn our attention to building a self-reliant defence force. That is something we could handle our own security. Some way we could handle our own security by ourselves. And for the first time ever, the government of the day put out a white paper, the 1976 white paper, which was a blueprint, a very substantial blueprint for how Australia could move towards being self-reliant in its defences. So that was the beginning of it all. Yes, John. Yeah.
After that promising start in 1976, I guess we're all a bit surprised that that retreat from self-reliance in defence started, particularly with the Gillard government in 2010 with the Marines in Darwin. What's the background of that and how did it happen?
Well, the background, I can never be sure of this, but the players in that, as you say, it was a surprise, an utter surprise to anybody who had been observing Australian defence for all that time. It was an utter surprise. And one of the players was our ambassador, Kim Beazley. Kim Beazley had formerly been a defence minister and managed to get himself into the position of our ambassador in Washington. Now, Beazley, his staff will tell you, those who know him closely, never believed in self-reliance. He thought the only way to secure Australia was to have America base its troops on our soil. And I think deep within Beazley's heart, he held the statement was made many years before he went to Washington. I think deeply within his heart, he was the architect of this turnaround. It suited the Labor Party. The Gillard government was in electoral disarray, and the thought of having all the pomp and circumstance of an American president appear in Parliament was certainly appealing to those who count electoral votes. So I think that's where the whole thing, if you want one signal sort of event and cause, I think that's what was at the root of the demise of self-reliance. Not that it was ever actually owned up to.
Mike, one issue at the time, I'm not to ask questions about, but my recollection is, and we had articles in Pearls and Irritations about that time, that the Marines in Darwin, it was just the beginning of other US requests or demands on us for the stationing of troops or access to our facilities. And one of them, I recall, was Cocos Keeling, which now is coming into play, that the Americans seem to be suggesting that they would like an upgraded airfield and support services at Cocos Keeling as part of their Indian Ocean projection of power. But that's just an example as the things that we speculated about then, and of course US submarines into Perth. And slowly, perhaps even quickly now, those things are coming into pass. But to come back to the time scale, clearly the Marines in Darwin from 2020 was followed probably by the major American coup, which was the Forced Posture Agreement 2014, which Tony Abbott and Julie Bishop negotiated with the United States. Could you describe what that Forced Posture Agreement really does in terms of United States access to Australia and our facilities?
Well, this is where the loss of our independence and self-reliance is actually codified in an official document signed by John Kerry and Julie Bishop in 2014, as you say, entitled the Forced Posture Agreement. It came about. It coincided with another white paper that came out under the Abbott government just before that was signed, in which for the first time in all those 35 years or so, the word self-reliance was not to be found anywhere in the white paper. So by absentia, the Abbott government was signalling that it was into something else other than self-reliance, without being upfront and specific about the fact that it essentially involved opening the doors to America. The way in which, that couldn't be left alone. The Americans are very thorough people. They're very bureaucratic, and they nail things down. And they've done a very truly Washingtonian job on Australia with this Forced Posture Agreement, which gives the Americans rights to base combat ships and aircraft and soldiers on our soil, on bases, which can be, those forces can be used by the Americans at any time, at their pleasure, to do anything that they want to do with.
It seems an extraordinary open-ended agreement.
It is extraordinary. There is some sort of fig leaf of